Timothy Edward Robinson was 56 years old, and on the surface, nothing about his life suggested it was about to quietly disappear. He lived in Portland, Oregon, a city defined by rivers, bridges, and routines that rarely draw attention to themselves. Timothy wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't running from the law. He was simply a man living his life, known to family and friends as private, thoughtful, and dependable. But on November 27th, 2008, Timothy Robinson vanished without a trace, and for more than a decade, no one could say for certain what happened to him. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep, respectful true crime stories told calmly and honestly, take a second to subscribe. These stories take time to research and tell properly, and your support keeps them coming. And as you listen, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like this reach people all over the world, and I always want to know who's here with me. That morning in late November, Timothy was last seen driving his silver 2008 Mazda sedan. It wasn't unusual for him to be alone, and it wasn't unusual for him to be driving. But what came next would haunt his family for years. Timothy left behind a note. In it, he indicated that he planned to drive his car into a river at a boat ramp. The message was brief, but its meaning was devastating. Almost immediately, concern turned into fear. Law enforcement was notified, and searches began. Given the contents of the note, attention focused on nearby waterways, particularly areas where a vehicle could enter the river without being seen. The Willamette River, wide, dark, and deceptively calm in places, became a central focus. Boat ramps were searched. Shorelines were scanned. Divers looked where they could. But days passed, then weeks, and there was nothing. No car, no debris, no sign that Timothy or his Mazda had ever entered the water. As time went on, the case grew colder. Searches were scaled back. Leads dried up. Timothy Robinson became one more name added to the long list of missing persons whose stories never seemed to reach an ending. His family was left in an impossible position, caught between what the note suggested and the absence of proof. Without a body, without a vehicle, there was no certainty. Only questions. Years turned into a decade. Technology improved. Rivers shifted. Sediments settled and resettled along the riverbed. To the outside world, Timothy's disappearance slowly faded from memory. But for the people who loved him, time didn't bring answers. It only stretched the silence. What no one realized was that the truth had been resting quietly beneath the surface all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a moment that wouldn't come for more than 12 years. And when it finally did, it would begin not with a new tip or a confession or a witness coming forward, but with a group of divers lowering themselves into dark water near a familiar boat ramp, unaware that they were about to close a chapter that had remained open for far too long. For more than a decade after Timothy Robinson disappeared, the Willamette River continued to flow through Oregon as it always had, indifferent to the questions left behind. Cars crossed its bridges every day. Boats launched from its ramps. People walked its banks without knowing what lay beneath the surface. And somewhere below, unseen and undisturbed, the answer to a 12-year mystery remained locked in place. In the years following Timothy's disappearance, investigators revisited the case periodically, but there was little to work with. The note he left suggested intent, but without physical evidence, nothing could be confirmed. No vehicle had been spotted entering the water. No sonar hits had produced results. No witnesses had come forward. Over time, the case file grew thinner, not because it was forgotten, but because there was nowhere else to look. Public records would later show that Timothy's name remained active in missing person databases year after year. His family never had the certainty that comes with an ending. Holidays passed with unanswered questions. Birthdays came and went. Each year that followed November 27th, 2008 only deepened the uncertainty. Was he truly gone, or had something else happened entirely? The absence of proof left room for hope, but also prolonged the pain. By 2020, a quiet shift was taking place beneath the surface of the Willamette River. Advances in underwater search technology and the growing efforts of specialized recovery teams had begun to change what was possible. Groups focused on locating submerged vehicles, often tied to long-forgotten cases, were systematically scanning waterways that had once been considered too difficult or too vast to search thoroughly. These operations weren't driven by new tips or sudden breakthroughs, but by persistence and improved tools. In May of that year, an underwater recovery operation was scheduled near the Jefferson Street Boat Ramp in Milwaukie, Oregon, a location that had been considered years earlier but never conclusively cleared. Using sonar and careful mapping of the riverbed, divers identified an object resting deep below the surface. At approximately 75 feet underwater, the shape became clearer. It wasn't debris. It wasn't natural. It was a vehicle. As divers descended to investigate, they confirmed what sonar had suggested. A silver sedan sat quietly on the riverbed, partially buried by sediment accumulated over years of moving water. The location was close enough to shore to explain how it could have gone unnoticed, yet deep enough to keep it hidden. When the team checked identifying features, the realization set in. The car matched the description of Timothy Robinson's missing 2008 Mazda. The recovery process was slow and deliberate. The vehicle had been underwater for more than a decade, and any sudden movement could cause further damage. As the car was carefully lifted from the riverbed and brought toward the surface, divers made a discovery that immediately changed the tone of the operation. Inside the vehicle were human remains. Law enforcement was notified without delay. What had begun as a routine underwater recovery instantly became the resolution of a long-standing missing person case. For the first time in 12 years, there was physical evidence. There was no longer just a note, a theory, or an unanswered question resting in file. There was now a vehicle, a location, and the beginning of answers that had been missing for far too long. But confirmation would take time. And for Timothy Robinson's family, the moment they had waited for and feared in equal measure was finally approaching. Once the vehicle was secured and removed from the river, investigators began the careful process of documenting everything. After 12 years underwater, the Mazda had become a sealed time capsule, its interior preserved in silence and darkness. Inside, human remains were located in the driver's area, exactly where Timothy Robinson would have been seated the day he disappeared. The position of the remains, combined with the condition of the vehicle, immediately suggested that the car had entered the river intentionally and had not been moved since. Forensic teams worked methodically. Given the length of time the vehicle had been submerged, identification would rely not on quick visual confirmation, but on records, comparisons, and testing. The car itself provided critical context. Its make, model, and registration aligned with Timothy's missing vehicle. The location, near a public boat ramp capable of allowing a car to enter the water unnoticed, matched what investigators had considered back in 2008. Piece by piece, the story that had once existed only as a theory began to solidify into fact. When the remains were examined and later confirmed to belong to Timothy Edward Robinson, the case that had lingered unresolved for 12 years finally reached clarity. There was no longer uncertainty about where he had gone, or what had happened after he was last seen driving his silver sedan. The note he left behind, once painful and inconclusive, now aligned with the physical evidence recovered from a river. For Timothy's family, the confirmation brought a complicated mix of emotions. The hope that quietly survived for more than a decade was replaced with certainty, and while that certainty came with grief, it also brought an end to waiting. Not knowing can be its own kind of torment. Having answers, even devastating ones, allows the mind to stop searching in the dark. Public records and missing person databases were updated. Timothy's case was no longer classified as unresolved. The mystery that had spanned more than a decade had been solved not by a sudden confession or a dramatic break, but by persistence, technology, and the quiet determination of people committed to finding what others could not see. The Willamette River, which had carried Timothy's secret for 12 years, had finally given it back. But the impact of this discovery didn't end with confirmation alone. The recovery raised difficult questions about how easily someone could disappear in plain sight, and how many other answers might still be hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be found. And for those closest to Timothy, the resolution marked the beginning of something else entirely. The process of remembering him not as a missing person, but as a man whose story at last had an ending. With confirmation came reflection. Investigators revisited the early days of Timothy Robinson's disappearance, comparing what was known then with what had finally been recovered. The location of the vehicle explained why searches in 2008 had come up empty. The Willamette River in that area is deeper than it appears on the surface, and currents slowly pull objects into positions that sonar technology at the time could easily miss. Over the years, layers of sediment had settled over the Mazda, disguising it as part of the riverbed itself. The recovery team later noted that cases like Timothy's are reminders of how unforgiving time and water can be. A vehicle can vanish just yards from where people pass every day, unseen for years. It wasn't negligence that left the case unresolved for so long. It was limitation. And those limitations had only recently begun to change. For the family, learning where Timothy had been all those years was painful, but it replaced speculation with truth. There was no longer a need to imagine endless possibilities. The story no longer branched into unanswered paths. It narrowed into one clear timeline that began with a man driving away on a November morning and ended beneath the surface of a river he likely believed would keep his secret forever. Law enforcement closed the case quietly, without press conferences or dramatic announcements. There was no crime to pursue, no suspect to identify. The resolution was factual, somber, and final. Timothy Robinson was no longer missing. He had been found. What remained was the human impact. For 12 years, his name had existed in databases and online forums, among thousands of others whose stories had stalled mid-sentence. Now, his case stood as one of the few that reached a conclusion long after hope had thinned. It became a reminder of why cold cases are never truly abandoned, only waiting for the right moment to speak again. The divers who located the vehicle returned to their work, continuing to search rivers and lakes for other answers still hidden below. Each recovery carried the same weight. Each one meant another family would no longer be left wondering. Timothy's case was not unique in its silence, but it was significant in its resolution. And as the river continued to flow past the Jefferson Street Boat Ramp, few people realized that a chapter of someone's life had finally been lifted from its depths, allowing a long-standing mystery to come to rest. 12 years after Timothy Edward Robinson disappeared, his family finally had something they'd been denied for so long: certainty. The questions that followed them through holidays, quiet evenings, and long stretches of silence were finally answered. Knowing what happened didn't erase the pain, but it ended the waiting. It allowed grief to take a shape and memories to settle where questions once lived. Timothy was no longer just a name on a missing person list or a case frozen in time. He was a man whose final moments had been found, whose story had been completed, and whose loved ones no longer had to imagine endless possibilities. The river that had hidden the truth for more than a decade had finally given it back, not through chance, but through persistence and patience. Cases like Timothy's remind us how quietly people can vanish, and how easily answers can exist just out of sight. They also remind us why these recoveries matter. Every submerged vehicle located, every name removed from a missing person database, represent a family that no longer has to live in uncertainty. Closure doesn't mean forgetting. It means finally being able to remember without searching. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you want more true crime cases told calmly, respectfully, and with care. And I'd really like to know your thoughts. Do you think advances in technology will help solve more long-missing cases like this in the future? Or are there still answers waiting in places we haven't thought to look? Let me know in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Thank you for being here.